Good morning, I'm Claire Noon and I'm a principal at NOUS Group, responsible for our regulatory practice. Before I joined NOUS, I was the Deputy Secretary of Justice and the Director of Consumer Affairs in Victoria. So I'm very familiar with Gerard Brody, our speaker this morning, and his work in looking at the enforcement outcomes from our regulators, consumer protection regulators. I've been working many years in regulatory policy reform at both the national and state level. I was also the first sponsor of this regulators community of practice in its earliest days in Victoria. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity today to take part in this webinar and to observe the growth in reach and depth of the community of practice. I'm going to make some observations of my own. Before I do, let me introduce my fellow speaker, Gerard Brody. Gerard Brody is the CEO of Consumer Action Law Centre, an independent, not-for-profit consumer organisation based in Melbourne. Consumer Action provides financial counselling, legal advice and representation to support vulnerable and disadvantaged Victorians. Gerard is also the chair of Consumers Federation of Australia, the peak body for consumer organisations in Australia. You may possibly be wondering why NRCoP has invited Gerard along to speak about measuring regulatory performance. After all, unlike most people in our audience, he isn't a regulator facing numerous stakeholders with conflicting and, might I say, misguided views about what he should be doing and how to measure and report on impact and outcomes. As it happens, Gerard faces many of the same challenges in measuring what he does as the rest of us, and he has a slide to prove it. But the main reason he's here is that Gerard and his organisation have gone to great lengths to put consumers' perspectives front and centre in evaluating regulatory performance. In this case, the enforcement performance of national and state regulators under consumer law. And I think it's important to understand that that brings a consumer and a community perspective to what we as the members, as regulators, actually do. So his presence and his organisation's report, which has been circulated to everybody here, is not only a case study about measuring performance, but it also serves to remind us that the important beneficiaries of our regulatory work are the citizens of our communities. So thank you and welcome, Gerard, for coming today.
Thanks so much.
I'd like to start now with putting some of my own perspectives based on the work we've been doing at NOUS Group. As I said, I'm a principal at NOUS Group, a consulting firm, an international consulting firm, and we do a lot of work both in regulatory policy, but also in regulatory practice, in regulatory performance. But let's start with a poll, and that is, let's check what we think about how well you think your organisation is doing in actually measuring your regulatory performance. So I'll invite you to start to take a Slido poll. For anyone who missed the opening announcement, go to Slido and the hashtag #regperform. And here's the poll question. How good do you think your organisation is at measuring and communicating your performance? Is it very good, reasonably good, about average, fairly poor, or very poor? And we'll invite you to respond at your leisure, and we'll have a look at the results at the end of the session. So go to Slido and both put in your poll results, but also put in your questions as well. And we can see we're already getting some results in the Slido poll. So I'd like now to move to making some observations about our regulatory performance measurement, and to do so, to think about putting up a couple of slides that think about what we've learned in our consulting practice, but also in my many years as a regulator. And I should say, and the prelude to this webinar said that measuring regulatory performance is a complex task, and that's absolutely true. And one of the things that I think is useful, and it's actually more than 20 years ago, or 20 years ago now, that Malcolm Sparrow observed that regulators are under unprecedented pressure, facing a range of demands, often of a contradictory nature. And so that includes be less intrusive, but be more effective, Be kinder and gentler, but don't let the bastards get away with anything. Focus your efforts, but be consistent. Process things quicker, but be more careful next time. Deal with important issues, but don't stray outside your authority. Be more responsive to the regulated community, but don't get captured by the industry. All of which shows the complexity that all of the regulators face in actually thinking about their performance and how they go about it. And to say that there are many frameworks for how to measure performance and how to think about reviewing regulatory performance is probably an understatement, with Productivity Commission, National Audit Office, New South Wales Outcomes and Risk-Based Regulator Approach, Australian Government Performance Guidance, all of which offer us some different views about how we might measure performance. So I'd like us to have a look at three broad questions. First of all, thinking about regulatory excellence and how we at NOUS conceive of that. And those of you who have attended some other forums that I've been at will be recognise this regulatory excellence triangle. And it looks to thinking about how do we align our regulatory approach with an integrated operating model and the capability to deliver. And then I want to look at, generally speaking, how do organisations measure performance, and particularly government guidelines, and then how do we think about bringing those two things together. So what you can see on your screen is a general approach to thinking about regulatory excellence. And what it seeks to do is to align the regulatory purpose and the regulator's strategy. Why do we exist, and what choices are made to enable this? And really getting an understanding of not just what's the purpose in terms of a higher order purpose, but also what are the particular outcomes or particular objectives we're trying to achieve. And in that, what is the change in behaviour or the change we want to see in the community to occur? And then we go to how do you shape your regulatory response to achieve those objectives? And that goes to questions like, what is your approach as a regulator? What is your emphasis? Or to use Commissioner Haynes' words, what is your regulatory posture? And then thinking about such issues as, how do we measure performance? How do we think about our regulatory resources? And how do we actually align those? And importantly, how do we then get things done with our regulatory partners? All of those matters are thinking about how do we shape our regulatory response. Then we think about the organisation and the way things actually get done. What are our business processes? What is the required capability for us to deliver? And what is the organisational culture that will support that? And then at the base of the pyramid, thinking about what are the physical assets or the physical things we need to have, and very importantly, what is our approach to data and technology, and how does use of data and technology both make our processes more efficient but also inform how we go about our regulatory response. And we talk about this a lot, and it's not the subject of today, but it is an emerging and important aspect of a regulator's work. And then we move to the next framework, which will show us about a regulatory, not just measuring regulatory agencies' performance, but also generally an outcomes measurement framework that applies more broadly to organisations. And thinking there about, from the base, what are the inputs, the activities and the outputs that lead us to the outcomes that then help us to achieve our vision or our purpose. So thinking about the inputs of what we use, the activities of what we do, the outputs, what we produce in terms of services or other outputs, and then thinking about the outcomes or objectives in terms of what changes we are seeking to achieve, and all of which goes to the higher order purpose or mandate for which we are here. And so that provides a general outcomes measurement framework that can be applied not just for regulators, but more broadly for organisations. And I should say that quite often we don't focus on the outcomes and the link between the inputs, activities and outputs to achieve those outcomes, and get caught in thinking about and measuring our performance, usually through our BP3 measures, which dictate how some of what we do as regulators, and also don't look necessarily to whether or not we achieved the outcomes. So we've now, moving to the next slide, tried to think about how you bring the alignment of the operating model and the alignment of the performance measurement framework together, and seeking to put those things together, have aligned the regulatory purpose and the mandate with the broad vision, and also the strategy with the outcomes. So you can see the colours don't directly align, and that's purposeful in terms of the strategy, how we achieve the strategy and outcomes is aligned there, and also what we do to achieve the outcomes in a strategic sense of what is our regulatory approach and how do we think about our risk alignment, how do we think about our resource use, and aligning that with the outputs, activities and enablers, the way things get done. So what we might think about measuring in terms of inputs, activities and outputs can be seen through the lens of business process. So have we got an efficient process? Have we got an effective process? Have we got the right staff in the right place doing the right job? Have we got the right behaviours and attitudes to actually achieve what we want to achieve? Have we got the right technology to support in terms of enabling? Have we got the right organisational structures? Do we understand roles and responsibilities? And thinking about measuring across those dimensions to actually broaden our thinking about inputs, activities and outputs, to actually think about it in a different way, and also to start to think about how do we measure the effectiveness of our information sharing, for example, with our regulatory partners. Some of these are challenges and some of these are things that we see as important for at least improving the way we think about what it is we might measure, and think about the outcomes, and think about the higher order vision or purpose that as regulators we're actually there to achieve. And so that in a sense gives a framing to the conversation that we're hoping to have today, and to start to think about how we might think a bit differently about outcomes measurement for regulators, and thinking very clearly about articulating what those outcomes are and what the overarching vision is that we're trying to achieve. So I'll leave that as a framing for you to think about, and then I'd like to invite Gerard to share the case study of his organisation's work, maybe for about 15 to 18 minutes, so that we've got plenty of time for questions. So I'll hand over to you, Gerard. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to yourself and ANZSOG for inviting me along today. So we are going to talk about Regulator Watch, which is a report Consumer Action has produced and published just in March. Just before I start, though, I'll talk a bit about Consumer Action. Claire's introduced us already. Our vision as a consumer advocacy organisation is a just marketplace where people have power and businesses play fair. We provide services to individuals, both legal assistance and financial counselling. We also have strong connections with the community sector more broadly, enabling community workers to help their clients. Because it's often them that are supporting the most vulnerable in the community. And we also seek to shape a fairer system. So learning from our interactions with individual consumers and seek to help to make their life easier by engaging in systemic advocacy. We also measure our impact. We have an impact framework, as an organisation, and we produce an annual impact report, which does use a sort of a theory of change that's not dissimilar to the one that Claire just took us through. That's a sort of excerpt from our the last impact report that talks about some of the statistics and our outputs, if you like. But we also hope have the framework that engenders a focus on outcomes and impact. So I'll jump right into our report. Why do we do this report, Regulator Watch? I guess firstly, we consider that effective enforcement is essential for a well-functioning consumer protection framework. This report is actually a second edition in a series. Where the first one was done a bit over 6, 7 years ago, actually in 2013. And the key finding of that report was that the regulators that examined did not consistently report on their enforcement activities or in a way that enabled comparison. And so we wanted to see what has changed. Over that time, of course, a lot has happened in the regulatory landscape. There has been reviews of the consumer law. There's been reviews of the administration of the consumer law by the Productivity Commission. And of course, there's been the Financial Services Royal Commission, which, while it focused on ASIC, its reflections, I think, were relevant to consumer protection regulators more broadly. So why do we focus on enforcement in the report? So we do acknowledge that regulators, of course, do a range of other work and tasks that have a positive effects. And examining enforcement is only one part of their remit. Regulators provide information and education, they provide regulatory guidance, they assist industry understand their compliance obligations. Some regulators help resolve individual disputes. And all that work undoubtedly promotes compliance and consumer protection. However, we do consider enforcement to be a key and important part of the regulator's toolkit, possibly the most important. And I think it's fair to say that regulators can face incentives not to engage in enforcement work. For example, it's expensive. They can be criticised if they lose big cases. But I think Commissioner Hayne made the point well, and I think that enforcement work was, he emphasised it was particularly important when regulating conduct. He indeed coined the "why not litigate" term, which has become very well known, which basically positions that unless it's plain that the public interest requires there to be no litigation, all forms of regulatory enforcement should be under consideration. And we hope that the role of our report reinforces Commissioner Hayne's point that public accountability about the use of regulator enforcement tools is important to deliver the public interest and to meet community expectations. So just quickly on the report methodology, it did focus, as Claire mentioned, on the regulators that oversee the Australian consumer law, the state-based fair trading agencies, ACCC, ASIC. There was some commentary in the report about other regulators that touch on consumer protection, including APRA, AFSA, the Australian Financial Security Authority, although they weren't part of the detailed consideration. What we did was basically look at the public reporting of what the regulators did in relation to enforcement, and we looked at we provided a score on each of the regulators in terms of a judgment. Firstly, on their reporting, the adequacy of the agency's reporting. We looked at a score for enforcement, whether it's over that time, there's an increasing or decreasing based on trends, including some assessment, I should say, about the nature of the matters, recognising that, there are some matters that are much more significant than others. And we also looked at relative enforcement performance for state and territory regulators, a comparative rate of prosecutions per 1 million of population. This replicates the methodology we did in 2013, so we wanted to match over time. The report also recognises the numbers are not everything. It does have a qualitative element, and I'll come back to that. We also looked at feedback from consumer groups. Again, I'll touch on that in a moment. For each regulator, we produced a scorecard. The point of the scorecard wasn't necessarily to compare regulators, but to give them a reflection about what they do. I just want to touch that, this report is not without its limitations, and it's not without its criticisms. And during the process of this work, we did receive some feedback from a number of the regulators about that. So I just wanted to say that we deliberately relied on publicly reported information only, and there was some criticism of that. Some regulators said that their annual reports are intentionally high level, so they didn't include all activities. But we considered that transparency of enforcement action by regulators to be an essential part of their role, contributing to community understanding and confidence. The 2017 report on consumer law enforcement administration by the Productivity Commission also found that reporting contributes to accountability and allows agencies to benchmark their performance. The Productivity Commission also recommended that the Australian consumer law regulators publish a comprehensive and comparable set of performance metrics. To our knowledge, that recommendation hasn't actually yet been implemented. On the point of comparison, yes, it does remain difficult. There has been greater alignment between the powers and tools amongst the various ACL regulators, but we still had difficulty comparing, and there were reporting discrepancies, different categorisation about what constitutes enforcement work, or different counting methodologies. Some count proceedings by commencement, others count proceedings by conclusion, which makes that comparison quite difficult. The Financial Services Royal Commission itself did criticise the methodology that we adopted. That quote there, the number of proceedings, will say little about ASIC's enforcement culture unless the decisions behind those numbers are evaluated. And we would agree. And the report does acknowledge the limits of purely quantitative measurement. And that's partly why the report also canvasses a range of issues beyond the numbers. And I'll come back to that. But we, while I would agree that an incremental rise or fall in the number of enforcement actions each year tells us little, without sort of further examination of the complexity of those matters or the importance of those matters, but we would say that a sharp increase or decrease in activity, or little or no enforcement by a particular regulator, can speak loudly about the effectiveness and culture of that regulator. And also, in absence of better performance measurement, we kind of were left with a decision: do we do nothing, or do we attempt to understand the enforcement landscape and advocate for improvements? And that's the route we chose. Perhaps later in the questions we can discuss more about the measurement of outcomes, which goes beyond counting things and looks more closely at impact. However, I would say that without counting output, I'd argue you can't fully consider outcomes. The key issues that the report covered, there were a number, and I won't touch on all of them. We looked at various regulatory reviews. We looked at various frameworks for regulating performance that Claire covered off as well. One of them, the Commonwealth Regulatory Performance Framework, we singled out for some criticism, which, given that framework focused primarily on the cost to business and compliance burden, at which we considered can have the perverse effect of taking the focus away from enforcing the law and protecting consumers. There was some detailed consideration in the report about enforcement policies that the regulators each publish. And there are probably three categories of policies that we identified. Firstly, policies that tend to reserve court proceedings to be a last resort tool, only for serious offenders or egregious conduct. Secondly, there were policies that reflect a sort of a right tool for the job approach, if you like. And thirdly, are policies that reflect a combination of those two. Obviously, we would say that last resort is problematic. It's sort of at odds with Commissioner Haynes' why not litigate approach. But we even raised some questions about the right tool for the job approach, which is often phrased as risk-based or proportional. And when we read those enforcement policies, we were kind of left scratching our head. They really were specific in the nature of the risks to be considered, or the consequences of different levels of risks being identified, or how proportionality is actually addressed in practice. And our concern is that this easily reverts into a softer approach, which becomes ingrained in regulatory culture rather than the harder enforcement work. One thing that we did call out that we support, and we saw a number of regulators using what we called a campaign approach, which involves being proactive to tackle emerging problems and using a range of complementary tools, information, education, and of course, strategic enforcement. The report did touch on the costs of enforcement. We recognise that regulators obviously have different resources available to them. We tried to do a bit of analysis of that, which was very difficult. And if anyone's interested in that, they can look at the appendix of the report. I'll keep on going just for time. We did also look at consumer advocate feedback. There's survey results we conducted through the Consumers Federation of Australia, and 100% of survey respondents said that publication of information on complaint and enforcement were important. And there was also a reporting about the need to improve systems to regularly and routinely report back to consumer organisations about outcomes of complaints made, and we touched on different mechanisms like super complaints, or different regulators have consultative committees and so on. The key recommendation for the report, though, relates to improved reporting framework and an enforcement reporting framework, covering off that it should be clear, comprehensive, frequent and timely, consistent, accessible, and clear reporting on resources. I'm not going to go through the detail of each of the scorecards of each of the regulators. You can look at that yourselves. But I would say that, at the national level, I think that our assessment was that regulators have largely remained strong in enforcement or improved over the period, including relating to reporting. But at the state and territory level, some of the agencies have improved performance. Some have probably remained weaker. And others are trending downwards. The other recommendations in the report, again, I won't go through them all. You can read them in your leisure, but they did cover things like, there's a clear recommendation to increase the quantity of enforcement work. We could maintain that may, as I said at the outset, a key part of the regulator's toolkit, and we think it must be used. We have some recommendations around enforcement policies, which I mentioned before, including adopting a campaign approach and recognising that in their enforcement policies. And we have seen some regulators adopt that and be very upfront to say at the start of the year what their priorities are going to be. We've got recommendations about the better use of data. We suggest that the consumer affairs regulators work together on things like super complaints, which is a type of process in other jurisdictions where nominated consumer groups can make complaints and report back to publicly and to consumer groups. We also make some recommendations around developing mechanisms, if you like, to determine whether markets and consumer protections are working for people experiencing vulnerability. Our organisation in particular, and many regulators, acknowledge that supporting the most disadvantaged and addressing vulnerability is a key task of regulators, and we've made some suggestions there. And finally, the last one I mentioned is that we really encourage more consistent use of media to publicise enforcement work. We were, I guess, surprised to see that some regulators are still reticent or inconsistent, perhaps, in how they use media and how they use media releases when they engage in enforcement work. Sometimes it's only at the conclusion of a matter rather than at the start of the matter, for example. Well, in conclusion, the key in this report, I guess, is for consumer protection regulators to firstly establish and nurture enforcement cultures within their agencies and across agencies. Also to align approaches to reporting, campaigning and enforcement activities, driving shared learning and efficiencies. And that's why it's so great to come along to an event like this. It's good to see that these sort of things are happening and the community of practice more broadly. And thirdly, I think it's so important to tell everyone what enforcement action has been taken and why, including consumer organisations, consumers, the media, and the marketplace. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks very much, Gerard. Thanks for that, Gerard. And now we're going to move straight into looking at some of the Slido questions. I think in summary, Gerard, I might be right in saying that you're looking to not just the thinking about the measurement, but also about the reporting on that, and more than just reporting, but actually communicating around that. And there are a couple of Slido questions about that reporting around that, and also about that communication. And the point I think you've raised is that from your point of view, it's really important that there is that communication, and also not just from the regulator, but a bit two-sided from your organisation as well. Do you want to just reflect further on that question?
Yeah, I very much agree. I mean, consumer organisations like mine and consumer advocates generally are great supporters of the work of regulators. We think they're essential, as I said at the outset, for a well-functioning consumer protection system and the marketplace more broadly. But what I guess I would encourage regulators to consider is bringing consumer organisations in and including them as much as possible and communicating to them, as you were saying, Claire. We don't want to be in the position where we're criticising regulators for not doing enough, perhaps, enforcement work, because that can, I guess, become a bit of a pile-on. Industry are very quick to criticise regulators if they think they're doing the wrong thing. And I'm not sure that's a regulator that's constantly criticised is a good thing for the market and consumer protection. So I think the way to kind of address that risk is to communicate really strongly and effectively with consumer groups, bring them in, and adopt some of the things we're talking about in this report, like a consistent and comprehensive reporting framework.
And there's a follow-on question to that, Gerard, in the Slido, which is, what would it take for regulators and consumer advocates to make common cause against periodic go-soft tendencies in government?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it does happen. You're right; those periodic go-soft tendencies. Again, I think that us talking as much as possible and communicating between consumer advocates and regulators and explaining why taking, for example, enforcement action is necessary and the effects of it. And if you do respond to complaints from consumer organisations that are relevant for your area of work or local to your jurisdiction, engaging them through that, reporting back to them, you'll get the third party sort of cheering from the sides from your consumer organisations. Oh, look, this regulator has done what the community wants, and I think that can help, I guess, inoculate the regulator from those criticisms that come with those go soft periods. Yeah.
There's a very popular question on Slido from Andrew Reid, and it says, regulatory activity often has long-term outcomes. How do we measure these long-term outcomes, and rather than just what's happening in the past year? Do you want to have a tackle of that first, Gerard, or shall I have a go?
Oh, I'm happy to start, Claire, and perhaps you'll have a contribution as well, I'm sure. So our report did try and look over a longer term. I mean, when we first did this report in 2013, it looked over a period of 10 years, in fact, of data around enforcement activity. And when we did it in 2013, we kind of thought that initially we might repeat it every year or every couple of years. But on reflection, I think it's right to have a bit of a gap between these types of things. So you can see, I guess, what happens over the longer term. Just looking at particular numbers for each year, as I said, isn't going to tell you very much. What will matter is a longer term trend and seeing, if the trend is all the way down or there is nothing in a period, then I think that's what tells you something about enforcement culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think I'd like to suggest and contribute here and go back to the framing that I put up initially and suggest that what we want to be thinking about is the broader vision, which is the much more long term. We really know that change takes a long time, and it takes a long time, perhaps 10 years, to achieve that much broader change in industry behaviour, or that much broader change in community and the way consumers respond in a positive, proactive, self-protective way, that it doesn't just happen overnight. And I think that distinguishes the broader purpose, whether it be fair markets, consumers, empowered consumers, or in the safety space, generally free from harm, if we want to put it in the broadest. And that's the long-term vision. And I think the next level down goes to the sort of objectives or outcomes that go to achieving that longer-term vision, which really starts to think about what are those, from a strategic planning perspective. We've got, if you like, a 10-year plan, a 3-year plan that says, well, what can we achieve in this 3 or 4 year period? And then what are we going to focus on in the immediate term to actually achieve those 3-year objectives? So you might have a 1-year corporate plan or business plan that contributes to those things. And it's being able to make the connection between what you're doing now, how that contributes to the objective in the 3 years, and that the longer term outcome is what you're really aiming for.
Yeah, I would agree, Claire. I mean, at Consumer Action, we, as I said at the outset, have our own impact framework. And in that framework, we've got sort of, we distinguish between impact and outcomes. Yes. So we've got activities and what we actually do day to day, inputs over here. Then secondly, they should have shorter term outcomes. So, if we're providing legal advice for someone, that person is getting information and feeling more empowered. But it's got to be very much aligned with the long-term impact. And a long-term impact, if you like, is the light on the hill, something that you're aiming for, that's part of your culture. But it can be really difficult to kind of, get the numbers that will measure the long-term impact, because there are multiple players that will influence that. Not just our one organisations that do that individually, but I nevertheless think it's really important to have that light on the hill, because it's your vision. It's what sort of drives you as you focus day to day on those shorter term outcomes.
I think that's an important point, which is it isn't just about the numbers. It's also about the qualitative contribution story, to use that term, that the regulator makes. And that also relates to a couple of the questions here on Slido. One is in terms of regulatory partnerships, and how do you, as co-regulators, if you like, also demonstrate the overall impact and outcome, not just of your own efforts, but of your efforts in working together. And if I might extend that as well to the previous question, which is, and the contribution that organisations like your own can also make, and how you think about A, working together, and B, disaggregating or aggregating the broader contribution. And I don't know if you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, what for our organisation, I'll start there, Claire. One of the short-term outcomes that we have is to influence regulator priorities. So we want to see, the issues that we see in our day-to-day work, find their way into the annual plans of regulators, because we can see that that's going to, contribute to change and hopefully have a longer-term effect. So it is a whole ecosystem, if you like. Yes, we look at what each individual party does, but I think we've got to work together to have the sum of the whole. I mean, the consumer law regulators obviously are very interesting, because they are they apply the same law, and there is an opportunity there to kind of really work together, and that happens, of course, through various committees that they operate. But we haven't seen that necessarily play out in the reporting frameworks that they've adopted. So that, the report does talk about, there is an annual report that's put out by all the consumer law regulators together, but it sort of cherry picks some good stories rather than goes through the detail of what actually has been done and what outcomes have been achieved.
But it is a bit of both we're talking about here, isn't it? Not just the numbers, but also about the, if you like, the storytelling, because that's how much more comprehensible to the community. And that's another question here about how do we make it comprehensible for the community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I guess that was something that everyone understood. Commissioner Haynes' criticisms that why aren't you harder? You're letting them. You're letting the industry off the hook. His criticism about treating the regulated population as clients rather than as regulated entity. That helped tell the story about where the culture he was wanting to engender, I guess. And I would agree that the narrative and the story you tell is very important to sit alongside the numbers and the outputs.
The other popular question on Slido is, when have you seen prevention well measured and tracked? And I'll answer this first, which is to say, not very often. And I think we've talked about the complexity of measurement, and through my experience as a regulator and in consulting, it's very difficult to actually have a counter to, if we weren't here, what would we have done? So to have your counterfactual in measuring prevention is very difficult. So not to walk away from the complexity, but I think it's also trying to do that in a qualitative way, which we've been talking about, but also to use sort of proxy measures that help to do that. And some of those go to things like how many people are actually engaging with your website, using your materials. How do you see that reflected in self-help? How do you look at a broader range of data from the point of view of complaints, from the point of view of what is said on websites, in the social media, those sorts of things. But I do think it's difficult. And do you have any insight to add in that, Gerard?
Oh, I agree. It's difficult as well. I guess I would say that looking also at the regulated population, what is their I guess posture, their conduct in relation to compliance. If you've got evidence that that all the businesses in this sector that you're regulating have strong compliance policies, then that's it's an indicator that there will be less harm, rather than sort of not just focusing on the consumer side of it, I guess, if you like, but if you focus on the industry as well. Yeah.
And I've been doing some work recently in relation to a particular industry where you'd probably assess the overall industry culture as non-compliant. And it would be interesting, and I haven't done this yet, but to think about how would you put a baseline measure to industry culture and then measure it subsequently. And I guess that was what was envisaged by Haynes Royal Commission, in that we've got a certain culture now, but if we're going to achieve a culture change in the industry, we need to have some view about how we're going to measure that shift in culture, which will be partly an indicator of the shift in posture or stance of the regulator and the work the regulator does. Do you have any views on how you might get a handle on industry culture measurement and change?
Look, again, I think it's difficult, and it's really interesting. I mean, obviously since the work of the Royal Commission, ASIC has tried to look at board levels of culture and have assessments at that level. They've also got the ongoing surveillance of people being inside institutions. I think that's a really interesting way to grapple with what's actually the culture, and that's not obviously easy for all regulators that don't have the capacity or resources to do that. But I think that's one important way to really understand what's going on inside a particular entity and the culture in it. Yeah, I think that it is a challenge.
Great. Thanks, Gerard, and thanks for your questions on Slido. I want to move now to just having a look at the data from the Slido poll. And as promised, we're going to take a break, but let's look at this first. And it's interesting to see here that we've got some participants who are happy that they're going quite well. So we've got 19% who are reasonably good and percentage who feel that they are very good. So we'll love to learn from the 2% who feel that they're very good. And we've got some who are quite a lot, 35% who are in the below average or poor range. So we recognise that there's some real opportunity there for improvement. And interestingly, we've got most people who feel as if they're doing it in an about average sort of way. So I guess that's what you'd expect statistically to see, that people feel as if they're in the average place. So I think that's been a great view, and I think it shows us there's a lot of opportunity for rethinking and improvement in our measurement approach, and hopefully from our discussion you've got some additional insights. You can see here that we have for your calendars on the 16th of June RegX, which is about achieving regulatory excellence, and on the 30th of June, what would culturally responsive regulation of Aboriginal organisations look like? And in that program, we've got 3 senior Aboriginal public servants from New South Wales and Queensland. An interesting question that arises when we're thinking about performance measurement and actually moving towards a more outcomes-based measurement approach is thinking about the question of the input measures or BP3 measures and the KPIs that talk about how many inspections we've done as the sort of primary issue for us to consider in terms of measurement, and moving away from those KPIs as a measure is sometimes quite difficult, and adding new measures or different measures. Did you, in looking at the data and information that was available when you were doing your report, Gerard, see that there were any of the consumer protection agencies actually moving beyond just that reporting of those, if you like, KPIs of numbers of things done towards actually using something else? Or is there any insight from your comparison and your review of what has been done that would be useful to share with other regulators as to what was actually good performance?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, most of them are still counting widgets, if you like. So they are looking at, and as I said, I think that's important. You can't measure outcomes without measuring outputs, I think, to start with. So I don't think we should stop doing that. But it shouldn't be the sole driver, as you say, on measuring outcomes, and in fact, it doesn't. Look, there probably wasn't a great lot of examples of measuring, outcome indicators, if you like. There was, I remember, I think it was one regulator, I can't quite remember which one, did try to survey, I guess, the community to, assess their understanding of the role of the regulator and their rights, and that being, a helpful indicator, I guess.
Yes.
And the consumer law regulators have, periodically done sort of those consumer and business surveys to kind of track understanding of consumer rights over time. And I think that is a helpful indicator to help us understand whether they're, the work they're doing to inform and empower is cutting through, if you like.
Yeah. And I think it's a question that I tackled as a regulator over many years. And one of the ways in which we thought about it was to really think about how do you move it over time. It's very difficult to move it quickly from saying, well, let's just take that old measurement framework and replace it with a new measurement framework. It's a very difficult matter. However, you can over time add detail or add different aspects to your activity that you measure in a holistic way. So, for example, adding in the use of the website and education as a sort of countermeasure to the number of inspections might be a way of thinking about where we're shifting our regulatory posture. Thinking about also, and this is a complex question of how you do measurement, but not all activity is equal. So how do you think about the actual input and in effect in a resource sense that reflects how much effort is put into a particular activity? Because and this is a bit of a question about how do you account for your outputs and the inputs to those outputs, because if you do 10 enforcement actions, that counts as 10 widgets, but they're about worth 100 each, if you like, or 200 each. And so it's that question that it really goes to how do you think much more in a nuanced way about each widget is not equal and it should not be counted as equal. And that's the question of how do we establish, if you like, some agreed counting rules within your own performance measurement framework that says an inspection isn't an inspection, it's a high level, a medium level, or a low level, level of complexity, and therefore the amount of input resources that's required for it. Now, moving to that is a complex and more difficult issue, but if we're going to have to measure inputs and outputs and continue to report on those as KPIs, we need to be thinking about doing it in a different way.
I would say, Claire, just to comment. One of the, I guess, where some of our recommendations, our broader recommendations in the report we're going to with this issue was sort of getting the most out of each widget, if you like. So yes, it's one widget, but if you're using a strategic approach that, as we talked about, a campaign way, that you're not just using enforcement, taking an action, you're doing education on the same issue, you're informing the regulated population, you're issuing guidance, that you're sort of boosting the effectiveness of one output. And likewise with our mantra around publicising and telling everyone what the action you're taking. We think that those sort of cultural postures can escalate and boost the effectiveness of each individual output.
There's a good and interesting and challenging question here on the Slido, which is, does measurement of regulatory performance actually translate into better outcomes? And if not, the effort taken to measure may be an opportunity cost. So it'd be interesting on your reflection on that, Gerard, given the work that you've done and the position you've presented today.
Yeah, I mean, Claire, I don't think so. As I said, I'm of the view that you've really got to measure the outputs before you can kind of dot the lines to outcomes and impact. And we, as we're an organisation that's funded by government, like regulators are as well, and so we have to account for each individual output we do, and I think that's appropriate. I mean, I think that they doing that and having a framework around it and having a thoughtful, we call it an impact framework, drives the culture that we're seeking and drives thinking about how we can, better measure outcomes and impact over time.
And I would say, in response to this question in particular, that the important thing for regulators is, and people have heard me before will have heard me say this, is to make sure that you have money in the bank for when things go wrong. And one of the ways of making sure you've got money in the bank is to build community confidence in and trust in you as a regulator that is demonstrated by what are you achieving, right? Not just what are you doing, but what are you achieving. And then people understand and trust and have confidence in you as the regulator that, yes, you're making a difference in this way. And that's the value in not just measuring outcomes, but also in actually communicating that achievement story or that contribution and the impact that you're having. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in quantitative terms as well, which is also part of what we've already discussed. But the real value in it, rather than the cost of it, is when things go wrong, which they inevitably do, and regulators are often, in my view, and others will be nodding, I'm sure, in the audience, often the first port of call for whose fault is it that this went wrong. And it's often the regulator's fault, or allegedly, and therefore if you've got money in the bank and people have trust and confidence in you because you are achieving outcomes or have shown that you have, then you've got a bank of goodwill to overcome or to ride through the inevitable rough patches. So in terms of value of measuring outcome, I think it shouldn't be underestimated, being able to measure and tell the story of the contribution and the difference that you make as a regulator in that regard. There's another question here, which we've talked about, is thinking about, there is a question here about whether it's easier to achieve your measure of regulatory excellence if you're independent and not in a department. But that's the perennial issue about institutions and
well,
how...
I might just say in response to that one, Claire, one observation we found during this report is that over time, the consumer affairs regulators have been brought more closely in departments, and I think that has not led to an increase in reporting. It became sort of diluted by what everything else the department did, if you like, rather than what that regulator is doing.
So are you saying that it did make a difference?
It made it work, the reporting less clear, less transparent.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I'm sorry to say that we've run out of time. It's been a most interesting and innovating discussion, Gerard. So thank you very much for your contribution, and make sure that you all stay safe in this time. And the NRCoP looks forward to your participation in future webinars. So it's been my pleasure, Claire Noon from NRCoP Group, to be with you here today, and thank you to our guest, Gerard Brody. So with that, we'll close. Thank you very much.